Hello, everyone. This is about 2 minutes before the actual start time. Just like the past sessions, we'll most likely start 2 minutes afterwards. So we'll start at 1:02 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, just to give people time to get in and not miss too much. Again, as a reminder, if you do have any questions throughout the session, please post those questions in the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll do our best to answer those questions as we go along. So again, we'll start at about 1:02 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you. Hello, everyone. It is 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We will start in about 2 minutes just to allow for people to get in and not miss too much of the session. So we will start at 1:02 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And again, if you do have any questions, please feel free to post those questions in the questionnaires box that is available to you in your GoToWebinar control panel. And we'll do our best to answer the question during the session. If we can't do it during, then we'll do our best to answer it afterwards. Or you can post to our community forum as well. So that's community.globalcyberalliance.org. So again, we'll start in 2 minutes. Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 4 of the DMARC Bootcamp. So again, my name is Shahzad Mirza. I'm the Director of Operations here at Global Cyber Alliance. So, this is going to be a critical aspect in terms of talking about DMARC, and that's going to be in terms of the reporting and the analysis of the information that actually comes in, and what are you going to do next with that information. So as a reminder, in terms of what we've done with DMARC so far, right? So we did talk about the authentication aspect, right? When we talked about SPF and DKIM, because those are the two authentication mechanisms that DMARC utilizes in order to do those checks in terms of determine passing and failing of messages, right? We also talked about conformance, right? The 3 different policy levels that are available to you when you create a DMARC policy, right? Again, those being none, quarantine, and reject. So now in this case, we're going to talk about reporting, because reporting is very important in order to help you get to where you need to get to in terms of enforcing the DMARC policy that you've created. Okay, because remember, when you're creating these DNS records in your systems, you do need to define that you're going to accept reports, or that you want reports, right? Because remember when we talked about this last week, if you just put in a value of v equals DMARC1 semicolon p equals none, you're not doing anything, right? You're not helping your organization. You do have a DMARC policy, but again, it's not an effective policy. And then you're not going to be changing your policy level from none, because you don't know how to, or whether you're ready or not to be able to do so. So that's why the reporting mechanism is going to be very important, because these reports that get generated are going to define for you whether you're not ready or not. This is what's going to give you that information that you need. And then as a reminder as well, the tags that you need in order to enable reporting on your policy is the RUA tag, which is for aggregate reports, and then the RUF tag, which is for your forensic or failure reports. And then I'm going to explain, again, we're going into details with each one of those and explain the types of things and information that you can get from each of those reports. Now, remember also, if you look at the complex record that you on the slide here, FO equals, RF equals, and RI equals are additional tags that you can consider using when you have your reporting options enabled. But remember, if you don't have this enabled, the default settings will go into place, right? For FO, you need that if you're going to use the RUF tags, right? And the default is actually 0, it's not 1. So, but 0 is the default setting. For RF, is your report format. The default is AFRF, and the other option is IODEF. And then for RI, that's your reporting interval, right? That's your reporting interval, and that's in seconds. So 86,400 seconds. So make sure when you define that, if you change the setting, realize that you're working in seconds and not in minutes or hours. So one question is, do you need the trailing semicolon? Yes, you do need to have the trailing semicolon. So there has to be a semicolon in between each tag. Do you need the one at the end? Our recommendation is yes, put the one at the end. Put that semicolon at the end. Now, also the thing to remember is how DMARC is actually working and where these reports are coming from, right? You're publishing your DMARC record in DNS. Your messages are going to go out like they typically go out. So your senders will send everything out and they'll do what they need to do. The recipient is the one that's going to check to see if the DMARC policy exists, right? And again, just make sure that, as a receiving side, you have DMARC verification turned on and enabled. Because as long as that's enabled, then it's going to check, incoming messages for a DMARC policy. If that policy exists, it's going to make sure those checks are being done for SPF, DKIM, alignment, and so on, and determine whether they're passing or failing. And then based on your settings, right, if you're policy level, that's how your messages are going to be handled. So now the key part is where are these reports coming from? The reports are coming from the recipient side. Okay, they're the ones who are going to pass on these reports to you. Why? Because they're the ones who know what's actually happening, right? They're the ones who are seeing where the messages are coming from, and they're the ones who are doing the checks, right? They're the ones who are going through and checking SPF, and they're checking DKIM, they're checking alignment, and they're checking if your DMARC policy, based on DMARC policy, whether it passes or fails, and what policy it's going to apply, what override may potentially be happening. Right? It's the recipient that knows, so they're the only ones who can actually provide you with these reports. So that's where these aggregate and forensic reports are going to be coming from. Okay, and then remember, in your policy, you're going to define whom you're going to send the reports to. Right? So those reports, remember, those reports are going to only go by default to internal, an email address internal to your organization. That's whom you can send it to by default. There are options in terms of sending it externally, some of which I talked about last week, but I'm going to reiterate that again in this session as well. Now, there's only two types of DMARC reports. There's the aggregate reports and the forensic reports. And I'm going to go into detail into both of these. So the first one, forensic or failure reports. These are your RUF tags. Okay, this is your RUF tag. When you define this, so RUF equals mail to : the email address you're going to send it to, semicolon, or comma mail to if you want additional addresses. This report, the way this works is actually, it's not technically a report. What this actually is actually going to be a full-blown message. So this is actually going to show you the message that potentially failed because of DMARC. So whether it be because of SPF, whether it be because of DKIM, it could be both, because of alignment, depending on which setting you choose, right? So it's actually going to be a full-blown message. And the benefit of getting one of these is the fact that you can actually now determine, what message it is, rather than having to go look and searching for the message. Okay, what is the message that was potentially dropped, or what is going to happen? Right. So that's why these reports are good to have. How many reports you can get? You could potentially get a lot of reports, right? Because it depends on how much email you send and how many of those emails are actually going to fail, right? And then also depending on how you define your FO tag in terms of what's going to trigger the failure report, right? But there is a problem with this, right? And a lot of good questions coming in about this, so I'm going to hopefully answer that question now. The RUF report, or the forensic failure reports, you may not get those. Okay, you may not get those because many recipient servers have decided not to send RUF reports. The reason why is because of privacy issues, right? Because remember what I said, so what's in the actual report is the full-blown message. So we're talking about message headers, so you can actually see who the message was coming from, who the message was intended to be sent to, and it could actually, and it will have the subject and it'll have the actual message of the body. So the message body within that report. So that can potentially contain a lot of information. In some cases, it can even include the attachments that are involved, right? So like, for example, some forensic reports that I have seen in the past, I've seen invoices, right? So it's an actual invoice with an attachment invoicing somebody, right? I've seen out of office messages actually that end up coming in as failure reports. So you have to be careful with this, and that's where the privacy issue comes into play. And that's where a lot of the big vendors like Google, Yahoo, Microsoft have said, okay, you know what, we don't want to send forensic reports because it's just, we don't want to deal with the privacy issues and the privacy concerns that are out there and the privacy regulations and laws, right? So they've stopped sending those types of reports. That's why you may not get any reports. Some of the smaller recipients that have DMARC verification, they do actually send them to you still. Okay, so don't expect to get a ton of these or a lot of these at this point. All right, so that's one of the things that when it comes into with these forensic and failure reports. And we've, in fact, like when we first initiated and started off with DMARC and working with other organizations, we actually told people to stop sending us forensic reports because of that concern, right? Because there's a privacy issue. So I do recommend that you do still have the RUF tag in there in case you do get some, but only keep it internal to yourselves. Don't send them out to a third party, right? Because you can have invoicing which can contain bank routing information that you're sending to other people. You can still, they can get that information in a third party. Do you really want to have the third party really get that information? You don't. So keep it internal to yourself when you set up the RUF tag. So when you do start, yes. So there's a question about if you have P equals none, do we recommend both RUA and RUF? Yes. We recommend RUA, definitely, that's required. Have that. RUF, we recommend that you do have the RUF tag, but only to an email address internal to your organization, right? For RUA, if you're using a third party to look at reports and things like that, yeah, that's fine. But RUF, keep that only internal to yourself and don't send it out to anybody else. So what does a forensic report look like? So here's just one example of one. So apologies that it's a little bit hard to read, but this is basically the message header. So we're only showing the message header section of it. And this is one that we found, and we found out on the internet that it's being used, and it's actually a valid one. This is actually one that we've seen a lot in terms of what ends up happening in terms of spam. So there was, if you look at it here, you'll see authentication results. So email.sesnam.cz was actually being used. It was actually sending out spam messages. I've seen this with a few organizations. So this is where things you'll see SPF alignment is failing, DKIM alignment is failing, right? So it's telling you this information. So it tells you things like delivery results. So in this case, the message was actually delivered, right? Because it's most likely the DMARC policy may have been set to none. Those things you have to things you have to check for, right? It shows you the DKIM signature. So what's the signature that was actually being used to sign the messages, right? And there's actually, in fact, there's actually two that are here, and it'll tell you, here's the subject line. Here it'll tell you where it's coming from, right? Who was the one who was sending it, who was the one who's looking, who it's being sent, who it's going to be sent to. So it tells you a lot of that information. So that way, again, you'll have to really actually take a look at these. So when you actually receive these, you'll see the message. You just have to open it up, take a look at it, review it, and see, okay, what are the areas that failed? What are the areas, things that are going on? Right, so without RUF reports, who do we find out what failed and fix it? That's where, at that point, you could use the aggregate reports, but the aggregate reports don't give you that much information. So you'd actually have to go through in your mail server, if you're seeing who messages are being sent out to, right? Because some email security gateways and email systems will actually store and record that information. That will require you to actually go back and start digging through within a certain time frame to see what was going on there. All right, but I just want to make sure that forensic reports are structured and set up in this, are understood, because that's what we're gonna, this is what we're gonna show you and talk about in terms of forensic reports. But again, you're probably not gonna get too many. For GCA, when we first started off doing it, we really don't get that many. Even though we have the RUF tag set up, we get them on occasion, and typically the most that I've seen on our end would tend to be out of office messages, primarily from LinkedIn. But now the next one, the aggregate reports. These are critical, right? Because these are the reports that are going to help you determine whether you're ready to go up to quarantine or reject. So that's why last week when I said the RUA tag it's really an optional tag. You don't have to have it, but from GCA standpoint, we're saying this RUA tag is required. Especially if you're starting off at none, have RUA tag, send it to an internal mail system, mailing address, and collect these reports and start reviewing these reports. So how do these reports work? They actually come in as an email with an attachment, and it's a zipped attachment. Okay, and inside that zipped attachment is going to be a report in an XML format. Okay, so it's an XML document that's in there. And I'll show you an example of what it looks like on the next slide. Now, how many reports could you potentially get? It really depends on how much email you're sending out, and also to how many domains you're sending email out to, right? Because for example, if you send out a newsletter, and your newsletter not only goes to like Gmail and Yahoo, but it also goes to like business partners and member organizations and things like that, and you have, say, 100 member organizations, you could potentially get 100 reports back, right? So those are things you have to take into account in terms of how many domains you're sending out, because typically what you should only get is only one report per domain, but you could potentially get more, right? So like if Google, you're sending it out, it may not just be a report just for Gmail users, it could be people who are G Suite users as well. So you may get a separate report for each G Suite user, but it may not have their domain. It's just typically just say Google, right? Because google.com is the one who's actually generating the report, not the actual domain owner in those situations. So those cloud providers would most likely send you the reports. So you do need to take into account. So now why, again, is aggregate reports important? I keep being repetitive because I want this to sink in. So that's why I'm being repetitive with a lot of these things. The aggregate reports are key because this is what is actually going to tell you the information. It's going to give you the IP address of the domain, the IP address of the system that's sending using your domain name. Okay. Now, hopefully in the report, the IP address is something you know. It's a legitimate system, the one that you own, and at least, or one that you know of. So it could be a third-party vendor as well. But it could also contain unauthorized systems as well, right? So if the receiving side is seeing messages coming from, an IP address that's not part of your SPF or from a completely different location, that's going to be in the report as well. Right, so the report will have your authorized systems and your unauthorized systems. So this is why that report is important, because you can go through there and say, okay, these are authorized systems. Okay, what's going on with the ones that are sending as authorized? So you can look at it and it'll tell you this is the number of messages that are being sent from that one IP address or that one system. It'll tell you if these messages are passing or failing DKIM, It'll tell you if it's passing or failing SPF, right? And also give you the domain alignment aspect of it. So are the domains aligning? So does the DKIM domain match the from domain? Does the SPF domain match the from domain? Right? These are the things that it'll tell you, and it'll tell you if DMARC is passing or failing. It also tells you what's your DMARC policy that was being used. It also tells you if there's something is being overridden. And I'll explain what overridden means in a bit. So those are things you have to take into account. So this is the benefit of having those reports, right? So you can use it in two ways, right? Not only to help you determine if you need to move up in enforcement levels for DMARC, you can also determine, okay, these are the ones that you know of, but then there might be some that you don't know of that are legitimate, but somebody on your team or in your organization decided to use it without informing the email or IT team saying that they decided to use this tool, right? They may have gone in, because anyone can go out and register for Constant Contact and MailChimp and start using those for newsletters or sending mass mail. And it happens, okay? I've seen many organizations where something like that has happened, and the IT team is not aware of it. So this is a way to build your IT asset inventory, right? You can determine, okay, we see MailChimp on here, but the IT staff isn't aware of it. There's no one on the IT staff who's admin of it. So you go out to your team and say, who's using MailChimp? Because if we go to an enforcement level, go to quarantine or reject, those messages are either going to go spam all the time or they're not going to be delivered whatsoever, right? And if nobody responds, you could always just go to reject, and then somebody will definitely respond back to you, right? So that's something you have to you take into account. But then you can also take the unauthorized systems, so the ones you have determined that these are actually spammers and these are phishers and things like that. You can use that information as well. This is why we still recommend that even if you have quarantine or reject, still look at the reports and collect that information if they're there, if it's present, right? If it's not present, that's great. That means your domain has been spam free, it hasn't been used in spam campaigns or phishing campaigns. But when they do pop up, you can take that information and potentially use that in block lists, right? Just be wary of what those IP addresses belong to, right? Because if those IP addresses end up belonging to, like, Yahoo or Amazon, then you may not, obviously you can't block those particular ones, but it's just something that you need to take into consideration. So one question is about going back to the RUF. How can we block RUFs from being sent from our domain? So if you have DMARC verification enabled, if your system that does DMARC verification, that's where you define the reportings, but only if it gives you that option, right? Because some systems will give you that option to enable or disable reports. Not everyone does that though. Some of them is just a check mark. You enable DMARC verification, and well, guess what? Then they do everything in terms of reports. So that's something that you need to consider that. All right, so let me keep going, because if I get wrapped in the questions, I'm not going to be able to finish. So let me keep going, and I'll get back to some of these questions. So here's a sample aggregate report, right? So this is an XML document. This is an actual report. This is one from Global Cyber Alliance from when we first started off in implementing DMARC. So when we got these reports, we looked at it. We went to quarantine. I said, you know what? We're new. We're fairly fresh, and we're not using anything. Let's just go straight to quarantine. So some of this you can see, it makes sense, right? Because it tells you the org name, it tells you the email address and things like that, but some things are not readable, right? But eventually this is only a snippet, right? This report is potentially long, because it depends on how many systems are we sending to and what time frame we're sending it within. So you can, if you want, you can open up the attachment, you can look at, unzip the attachment, you can look at the XML document and then eyeball it, but we don't recommend doing that. All right, and in a few slides later, I'll explain some options that you have in terms of what you can do. But what you obviously want to do is you want a human readable format. You want to be able to see this appropriately, right? And this is an example of an aggregate report in a nice human readable format, right? Because it splits it up for you appropriately. It shows you all the domains. It shows you the IP addresses. This one, in this case, it actually does a lookup of those IP addresses for you. It tells you what countries those IP addresses are coming from. It tells you how many messages were sent from those IP addresses. So again, this is all stuff that's in that report. It tells you what policy is being applied. It tells you an override reason. So what override means is that there are actually some there is an option at the receiving side to override your policy, right? And there are organizations that actually do that. Like for example, Microsoft does that. Microsoft actually will override your policy if you set your policy to reject. They actually treat all DMARC policies set to reject as quarantine. And they have their reasons for it. And if you're interested in that, I can send you a link in terms of what the reasoning is for that. But there's some other organization, like I believe Semantic, Proofpoint, and some other organizations as well do the same thing. They will actually override. And this will tell you if there is a situation where it was overridden. That's in the report. Then the report also breaks apart how your DKIM is set up. So it'll tell you if your DMARC is aligned. So this is where it tells you about the alignment aspect of it. So the DMARC alignment checks. It tells you if it passed or failed. It tells you what domain is being used for DKIM signing. Then it says the same exact thing for SPF. So it tells you if the alignment is okay, tells you if it passes or fails, and then it also tells you about the SPF domain that's being used. So these are things that it's going to tell you about. So I've also gotten in the past a lot of questions in terms of how does DMARC actually pass or fail. So you got to remember, you don't need everything to pass in order for DMARC to consider a pass, right? Ideally, the situation is what you see in the first row, that everything is passing, everything is aligning. That's the most ideal situation. But there could be cases where DKIM alignment is off, but SPF is perfectly fine. So it's passing and it's aligned. That is considered a pass, right? Just because DKIM is unaligned doesn't mean you're going to fail. So as long as one of the two, so either SPF as a whole or DKIM as a whole passes, then you're fine, right? The only issue where you're going to really deal with failures is if everything fails. And this is why we say that when it's a certain situation, if you just have SPF, you can get away with it if you don't have DKIM. But as soon as that SPF alignment at any point fails, then you have an issue. You're unaligned at that point because you don't have DKIM to double check it. So you're going to get a failure. So these are things that you need to look out for. So the ideal situation is to have what you see in the first row with everything passing and everything aligning. But we understand there are going to be cases, especially with third parties, where you're not going to have that situation. And honestly, what you typically end up having the most control over is DKIM, right? SPF with third parties, you don't really have that control because they don't always use your domain name, right? We've seen that in cases with a lot of organizations where DKIM is fine, but SPF alignment is always off. But you're okay because it's still going to be considered a pass for DMARC overall. So those are things that you need to take into account and the things that you need in consideration. So we gave you this chart on this slide to do this. So just to reiterate a few things too. So what do we mean by alignment? Because this is something that we also got questions in regards to in the past. So we did talk about this in week 2, but as a refresher, right? When it comes to SPF alignment, what are the things that is being checked? Remember, it's in the header. It's the from address is being compared to the return path address. So as long as these two match, that's considered an aligned. That's considered DMARC aligned, right? A failure is if the from address does not match the return path. Right? This is a failure then at this point because they're not even the same domains. They're not even close, not even a subdomain. So that's considered unaligned or failed unaligned. So it's not going to pass in that case for DMARC. Right? So if you want it to be aligned, you need to make sure that both of these match. Okay? So that's where SPF alignment comes into play. So just to give you an example, right? Ideally, you'd like to see everything aligned, but you may not get that. That's typically the case with third-party vendors, right? And you see here, it says SPF raw, it passes. Why did SPF pass, but DMARC is saying it's failed unaligned? So overall, it failed. The reason for DMARC concerns, it failed. The reason why is because, again, right, when an SPF check is happening, it's checking this domain to see if the IP address that's sending this message is correct. So SPF will pass because this is the domain that's actually sending the information or sending the message, right? So this is something you have to take into account. Just because it says pass here and it's failed unaligned, it's because this domain is not passing. This domain is not passing the from address. Same thing with DKIM, right? A pass is as long as the from address matches the domain and the DKIM signature. A fail is if the domain does not match the from address in here. That's what the alignment issue comes into play. So those are called DMARC fails. So that's why you get DKIM DMARC fail unaligned. If you're going to get these, you're going to have problems. So if DKIM fails and SPF fails for failed unaligned, nothing. Your DMARC, as far as DMARC is concerned, that's a fail. So things to look for. So along the line, so not only looking for alignment, so here's some additional examples of things to consider and things to look for. So things like DKIM issues, right? So in this case here, in this case here, you'll see that, the domain is Global Cyber Alliance. Google is the one who's sending the messages. No policy was applied, but there's failures. So in this case, we were set to none. But for DKIM, you'll see that DMARC failed, raw failed, and domain globalcyberalliance.org. Well, the domain is right, so how come it failed? Right? The reason it failed is because when we put in the DKIM signature, it was put in incorrectly. So there's an issue there. There's a problem in the terms of the way we set it up. So it wasn't being recognized appropriately. So when I went back to look at it, we found out that the vendor that actually, when I asked them to put in the key, they put it in incorrectly. They didn't put it in to completion. They only put in the partial key. So when it did the checks, it was failing. But DMARC was aligned for SPF. Everything was aligned and passed, so the messages were still being delivered. Right. The second one, it gives a perm error because again, things were not set up correctly. Even though we went back and forth on this, things still weren't set up correctly. So there were still a failure. It's because again, DKIM was not set up correctly in DNS. All right, so that's where you can see. So it says that there's something there, but it's most likely because the key was set up incorrectly, and this is typically when you're doing TXT files. That's where you run into the issues, right? With DKIM, some DNS servers don't accept greater than the 1024 size key. So if you're using 2048, some DNS servers won't accept that because it's too large. It's greater than 255 characters. So you have to do certain things in order to break it apart. And if you don't break it apart correctly, then there's a problem, right? Then you're going to run into an issue. And that's the issues that we ran into. So I actually had to lower my key to 1024 in order for it to actually go in the right way. So possible spoofing type things. Right here, right? So we have two. I'm giving you a few examples. So like one is just a minor one. It's only one message, but you see that Global Cyber Alliance is the domain that's being used. This is the IP address that's sending it. Here's the pointer record. So this sssmail.com, which is in, I believe that's Germany. One message was sent. We have no idea who that system is or who that service system belongs to. In this case, the message was quarantine because we were at quarantine at this point. Right, but you see that DKIM, everything failed. There was DMARC failed because there was no DKIM set up. So there's no domain, no DKIM. SPF failed because there is no SPF record for this domain. So that this is a message that got quarantined. So it went to someone's spam or junk folder. Right, so these are the things that we're looking out for in terms of spamming messages, because we want these messages not just to be quarantined, but we would like them to get rejected. So here below, if you go even further, so here's another 2 IP addresses, and this one sent out more messages. So 42 messages were sent out from this IP address. In this case, the messages were rejected because we were at a reject level, right? And then it's checking again, it's telling you about the DMARC and DKIM, it's giving you the domain information and so on. So in this case, you can see the DKIM it tried to use a subdomain, abo.globalcyberalliance.org. In this case, it's even telling me what the selector name was mail. Well, guess what? globalcyberalliance.org doesn't have an abo.domain, right? We have our policy set up so that it's at reject, so we're not allowing any subdomains to be used, right? So this is not considered. So when it went to look up, mail._domain_key.abo.globalcyberalliance.org, it found that it doesn't exist. So then there's no DKIM value, so it was a fail. Right? And then everything else failed as well because these things don't have it. So, but we at least know that, mailjet.com was being used, server.domain.com were being used. So that's an example of spoofed IP addresses. Now, the other thing is though, say for example, these were legitimate. Well, guess what? Those 42, if this was legitimate, those 42 messages were rejected. So what do I have to do in that situation? I have to find out, okay, this is a valid system. Now I need to go back and take a look at my SPF. Or sorry, I need to go back and go to server.domain.com. So I have to go back to domain.com and say, hey, we're using you guys to send messages and you're using our domain name. I need to know what the SPF record that I need to implement on my SPF. So I need to include : information or IP information, depending on how they provide it to you. Then I need you to supply me with a domain key so that way, or a DKIM entry, so that way I can actually let these messages go through legitimately. Because otherwise, the only way to allow those 42 messages to go through is to reduce my DMARC policy to either none or quarantine. Right, so that's where it's going to happen and where there's going to things. So the question about those 42 were sent to random third-party recipients, but DKIM prevented them from being sent. Is that correct? So not only DKIM, actually, in those cases, the 42 is both because really DKIM and SPF, both of those failed. Because since both failed, then those messages were getting rejected. Who they were getting sent to, it depends on who those reports are coming from. So in this case, it says the reporters google.com. So these were most likely sent to either Gmail users or G Suite users. From being so these messages were failed. Because remember, both DKIM and SPF failed. So that's why it wasn't delivered. If for somehow the SPF were to pass, so if DMARC said aligned, SPF raw passed, and the domain was actually globalcyberalliance.org, that these 42 messages would have gone through. Okay. And then the last one is just showing again some DKIM and SPF issues. So some of you may have seen things like this, but again, what happened here is that the pointer record shows that the IP address is something at hostedmail.com in Canada. This message got quarantined, but because of, if you look at it, DMARC failed unaligned for DKIM. Why? Because Global Cyber Alliance and yada yada yada. This domain, we don't have a DKIM key for that domain, right? And that DKIM domain is not globalcyberalliance.org, so therefore it failed. So the domain doesn't match the from domain in the beginning, so therefore it fails. Sorry, just to be more specific, it failed unaligned. So the alignment failure in this case. The raw passes because this Global Cyber Alliance and so on and so forth, that's a valid Gmail system. So that was, when it looked it up, it found a DKIM key for us that Google created by default. So that was there. But if you look at SPF, right, SPF, it was a fail. The raw soft fail, because we were using ~all. Remember, right? SPF has the all factor in place, right? You have the -all for hard fail, ~all for soft fail. So at the time we were using ~all, and the domain was globalcyberalliance.org. Right? This was still quarantined, right? Because DKIM failed, the alignment failed here. In this case, SPF was considered a fail because even though the domain was globalcyberalliance.org, this IP address was a soft fail. So this IP address doesn't belong, it was not in our SPF and for globalcyberalliance.org. So therefore, this was considered a soft fail. So therefore, overall, it failed. So therefore, this message was quarantined. So these are some of the examples in terms of what kind of things happen and what kind of things are occurring. And to give some examples, hopefully, I also answered a lot of questions in this case that are out there. So how can you review those reports? Right? What are some of your options available to you? So there are service providers. So what these do is these are your third-party vendors that you can actually send reports to, right? And there's obviously going to be a cost associated with it, depending on whom you go with. Some of them do have free level tiers, but there's limitations in terms of the free tier, and the limitation that typically ends up being the number of emails and things like that are out there. Some of these vendors actually provide more services than just DMARC. right? So like a Gari and Proofpoint, for example, they act and 250 OK. They actually provide other email security services as well. They don't just do DMARC. So we have DMARC Analyzer there. DMARC Analyzer actually got bought by Mimecast. So if you have Mimecast servers, you may want to talk to your salesperson to see if they can include the DMARC Analyzer portion into your costs. So something that could take into consideration. But all of them provide different capabilities, different features, but ultimately they're the ones who would consume your aggregate reports. So in your RUA tag, you would put in a mail to : and then the email address that they provide to you and give to you to put in. And then they'll take your reports. They'll give you these nice views in terms of what you're seeing over here in terms of the graphics. They're the ones who will give you these nice views in terms of giving this information. Plus, they'll give you historical views. They'll give you a certain time frame, like a 7 days worth period, 14 days, 30-day period, in terms of where you can view your information and see what kind of trends and things like that you're seeing. You can do it on your own as well. So there are various free options. Okay, so I put free in quotes because depending on which mechanism you use, the free is in terms of it may not cost you as much, but you may have to set up your own systems. Like for example, the UK National Cybersecurity Center, they have a mail check system. St. Louis County developed something called the Elastic Mark. Parse DMARC, which is also a really great tool. These are tools that you can download and they're free to use, but you do have to have some sort of infrastructure in place, right? Because you need to be able to accept reports, accept messages on these systems. So you do have to develop that. So you may need to have either an internal server set up or maybe a cloud type infrastructure set up in order to collect this information and be able to build some of this stuff too. Valley Mail Monitor is a free service from Valley Mail that you can actually send reports to it, and it gives you an aggregate view of certain things. Doesn't give you everything that you may want to use, but it gives you at least a starting point to get some of that information and be able to go back and take a look at what you need to do. You do have XML to human converters. So like DMARC actually provides an XML uploader. You can go to their website, you can upload each of those reports. So you don't even have to unzip it. You just take the zipped file, upload it to this, and what they will do is they'll give you a web-based format and then a nice human readable format of each of those messages. Now, the thing is, as I say, it's best in small numbers, because the way it works is that if you upload 10 reports, you get 10 HTML links. So you get 10 web links. You actually have to review each report individually, right? So if you have 50 reports and you upload 50 reports, you're going to be getting 50 links so you still have to go through each link individually to review it. Okay, so that's why they're saying, so there might be free, but there's going to be a level of effort that you're going to have to put in. You're going to have to do the analysis of each of these reports, right? There's other things like Postmark. Postmark gives a free capability as well, but they send a report on a weekly basis, right? So if you can't wait a week because you're part of a spam campaign, you need to move quickly. Postmark, the free version of Postmark may not be an option. MX Toolbox also I've heard is fairly well, but it does give you some limited information. It may not go into the level of details that is there. And there's other third-party tools. I mean, some of these tools are a little bit older. DMARC.org, which is a great site for information. You can go there. They have a code and library page, and there's some other tools listed there as well that you can consider using. If you're familiar with GitHub, GitHub is a software repository for open source tools. You can pop in DMARC, and there'll be a nice list of DMARC parsers that are in there, and you can pick and choose whichever one you'd like to use. And some of them will give you the information. Some of them they just give you pretty graphs, but some of them will actually give you the raw data and give it to you in a nice format for you to view. All right, so I'm going to keep going, and I'll come back to the questions that are listed. There's a lot of great questions here, and we just have a few more slides that I just want to get through before I get to the questions. So another thing that's out there is where, like, remember when I said when you define the RUA and RUF tags, by default the reports can only go to the internal organization, or to an email address internal to your organization. You can send to external ones, but you have to do additional things, and this is what they call external destination verification. So I did give these examples last week. I just didn't do it in the Linux session. I did it in the Windows session, and I did it in the Cloud DNS session, but this is just to cover it again, is that if you want to send an external domain, the receiving side, so the people you're sending the reports to, they actually have to create TXT records, a TXT record to be able to accept those reports. Otherwise, they cannot. All right. The only one who actually doesn't follow this rule is Google. Google actually will send you reports regardless of the fact of whether you're willing to accept them or not. I'm not sure why Google does that. But they do that because I've been getting reports on my DMARC.org address from people who have set it up to send me reports, and I get the Google reports, and that's the only ones I get. I don't get it from any other locations. But either way, don't use DMARC.org to send reports to, because I don't actually use that and look at it. But don't send it to globalcyberalliance.org either, please. Don't send us your reports. But what you have to basically do is, at the receiving side, if you want to receive those reports, because people need to set this up, because if you own like a .net, .org, .com, right? So say .org is the one you actually use for email, .net and .com you don't, but you want to see those reports in case, you know, the .net and .com are being used. You can't send them to the .org unless you do this. And what you need to do is you put in the reporting domain, the name of the TXT record you create. So it'll be reporting domain ._report._DMARC. Then again, depending on your DNS system, you may have to add the fully qualified domain name, but in majority of cases you don't. And then the value of that record is just going to be v equals DMARC1 semicolon, and that's it. Right. So the example here, so if I have .dmarc.com and I want to send it to a .dmarc.org email address, excuse me, I need to put in .dmarc.com._report._dmarc.dmarc.org, and then the record of that value, the value of this record would be v equals DMARC1 semicolon. Right, then now I can actually start getting reports from the .dmarc.com domain. Right, so this is important to realize this, because this is what those DMARC vendors will ultimately end up doing. Actually, they have some other mechanisms to do, but they ultimately have records like this that they're going to be able to accept your reports and allow them to come in. Now, the other thing is, it's like I've already mentioned this previously, but I want to reiterate again, because people who will follow GDPR, right, or people who are the areas you have privacy laws, right, like in California, for example. The only issue where it comes to privacy, when it comes to these DMARC reports, is with those forensic reports, right? Because those forensic reports, again, it's going to have so much detailed information. It's going to have the message headers, it's going to have the message body. So there is going to be that issue of privacy, and that's why a lot of the major vendors do not send those RUF reports or these forensic reports, right? So there are talks about like taking things into consideration, like maybe redacting certain aspects of the reports, maybe not give everything and take certain things out. You know, maybe not give the message body so people can't actually read what the message actually was. You know, certain things maybe, you know, you take it, but those are still things in discussion and things that are being talked about. But when you set these up, remember, right, only send the reports to email addresses defined in the policy. So RUF, only send it to your internal organization, right? People who are trusted within your organization to actually be able to do this and not do anything, you know, wrong with it, right? So make sure you do that, and make sure you have that, that you set it up in that sense. Don't send those forensic reports to third parties, right? Because they don't need that information, you know, and there's, especially in cases of sensitivity of what could potentially be in those reports. But remember, with aggregate reports, right? The aggregate reports, yes, it has IP addresses, and in some cases, you know, depending on which service you use, they'll do those lookup of those IP addresses for you. But it depends on how you're using that IP address, right? You're not profiling somebody, right? You're not using that IP address to create a profile about an individual, right? You're just, you know, because most of those IP addresses, you're just getting the top level domain that's actually being used, that, you know, with the mail servers actually being used to send it, right? So those are things you have to, you know, so you're not really, there's nothing sensitive. Now, if you're taking that information and creating a profile out of it to try to figure out who the individual is and create those kinds of things, then yes, you're going to go against things like GDPR and privacy aspects of it, but be wary of those things. So what's next, right? I mean, we showed you a few things in terms of those reports. So if you're getting those reports, review those reports, right? We gave you 2 sets of options. Either you can go with a vendor through a paid service, or you can use some of those free tools, right? You can, if you choose whichever mechanisms you use and you're getting reports, you're welcome to reach out to us and we'll kind of help you interpret some of those reports as well. I've done that for a few people already, right? They have the service. We get on the conference call. They just, they share their screen. They show me the report. I take a look at it. I explain to them what we're seeing in this report. But those reports are going to be important because that's what's going to find whether you're ready or not to move to quarantine or reject, right? And even if you're at quarantine or reject, I do recommend reviewing those reports. You may not be reviewing them on a daily basis. Maybe you're looking at them once or twice a week. But you want to continuously get those reports, because if somebody calls you up and says, hey, these messages aren't getting through, you can at least check the DMARC reports to say whether or not, okay, is it because of DMARC? Because if it doesn't show up in the DMARC reports, it's most likely because of something else. But remember, with the key things you're adjusting are SPF and potentially either adjusting your DKIM key or creating new DKIM keys. All right, these are the things that you're going to be doing. So some additional resources. So again, DMARC.org is a great site. Why? Because those are the creators of DMARC. They're the ones who created that site and put the site together, and it has a lot of great technical resources on there. Obviously, you have GCA's website. If you have questions about reports, either can email us directly or post them on the community forum, right? We push people towards the community forum because there's more people other than myself and GCA people that actually have access to this, that are subject matter experts. They're not there to sell anything. They're just to help you interpret and read some of the questions and answer your questions. And of course, again, all these bootcamp resources, we're putting them up here on as links on there. So there's going to be a ton of resources that'll be available to you. We have a lot of vendor presentations the last bootcamp, so the one we did in the fall, the vendors actually did presentations with their tools and giving their information. So we're going to put those links up as well on the resource page, so you can go back. And so if there's certain vendors you're interested in, you can look at their videos and their information about our DMARC reports, and you can actually see their tool as well. So we'll put those up. Those should be up by the end of the week, hopefully by the close of business on Friday, if not sooner. So keep a lookout for that on the website. So now I'm going to just go back and go look at questions. So if you do have any questions, please post them up here, and I'm going to go through and answer as many questions as I can, and hopefully, if I haven't already, answer those questions if I skip any. So do you recommend sending RUAs to both your reporting provider and an internal email? Personally, yes, I think you should send it to both, right? And the only reason I say that you should send it to both is that way you at least know that these reports are actually being sent and being delivered. In this case too, the reporting system is where you can actually get the information, but if you ever actually had to pull out a report for yourself, then you can do so. Because remember, the reporting providers typically only keep your reports for a certain number of days. So there's a certain there's a time limit on it. So eventually those older reports will eventually age out and you're not going to be able to see those. So if for some reason you had to go something out with that's more than 30 days, at least you have a copy of those reports and you can actually look at those reports. So do every recipient's servers send back an aggregate report? No, they don't. That is a very good question. Not all of them do. There are quite a few. So Microsoft, yes, you have listed Microsoft. Microsoft does not send aggregate reports. There's other organizations, like I believe Proofpoint is another one, and there's a few other ones as well that do not send aggregate reports. Whether they are going to, I don't know. There are rumors of Microsoft potentially turning that back on because people are really pushing them, because Microsoft is a huge proponent of the global wide aspect of it with Office 365, with Hotmail, Outlook, and so on. So that's a large chunk of aggregate reports that are missing in terms of what's happening. But right now, yeah, there are some that are out there. And the other thing is to take into account, like again, Microsoft also does override your DMARC or reject policy. So anything, if you have a reject policy, it actually makes a quarantine. So I mean, that could be one reason why they don't send RUA reports, because it's not going to help you anyways. But you'll still have the override reason in there. At least you'll know what's still going. So there are a lot of groups that are encouraging Microsoft to do it, and hopefully they'll do it. Can a pass unaligned situation occur, and is it ultimately a pass or a fail? So yes, you can have pass unaligned. Ultimately, that's a fail, right? Because you have to have so for DKIM, you have to have DKIM pass and DKIM aligned in order for it to be proper. And same with SPF, right? So it doesn't have to be DKIM where it's pass. So it's where if DKIM passes and is aligned, and SPF passes but unaligned, that's still a DMARC pass because DKIM was fully passing. So is DMARC fail equal message failed to deliver? And do we know how to drill down for more details of a failed delivery? So yeah, if the DMARC failed, so if both SPF and DKIM failed, so both failed and the alignment failed, then that means that the message failed to deliver, depending on your policy level, right? Because if you're at none, technically, even if everything failed, the message still passed. It was still technically passed. Your DMARC policy is set to none, right? Because there's no enforcement at that point. If you're at quarantine or reject, then yes, that's where, right? Quarantine is going to send it to the spam folder. Reject is not going to deliver the message. So how do you drill down to those? So unless they send you an RUF report, what you're going to basically have to do is go back into your mail servers, check out the history if you collect it, and see, within that 24-hour period or whatever time frame that report came in, that's where you're going to have to do and check those things. For alignment and subdomains. Okay, so for alignment and subdomains, so depending on if you set your DMARC policy and you leave it to the default for ADKIM and ASPF, and you're using subdomains as the from, and then the DKIM and the SPF is still using like the top level domain, you should still be fine. But once you set it to strict, you're going to have issues. Best thing to do though is, and especially this will help with things like with the SPF 10 domain lookup, for subdomains, create a DKIM policy for that subdomain and create SPF for that subdomain. So that way you don't have to worry about it, because everything in that case will be aligned and you don't have to worry about any issues when it comes to it. So that's really the recommendation, is set up a policy, a DMARC policy, SPF and DKIM for the subdomain. That way you don't have to worry about things like alignment and such. And you don't have to worry about things like SPF 10 domain lookups and whatnot. So ValueMail is a free option. So the ValueMail Monitor is a free option. It's not just for Office 365. They actually opened it up. So if you choose to use ValueMail Monitor, you're not restricted to Office 365. You can actually use it for any type of systems. But I think they may have a restriction in terms of how many messages they can get within a certain time frame, which I think is on a monthly basis. So I don't know all the details on that. So there's a question about SPF and having multiple SPF records. If you could email me directly on that, that'd probably be the best way to answer that question and go and review that. What does multiple DKIM entries in a single aggregate report mean? So it depends on where it shows up in the report. I mean, it could be that if in an aggregate report, it could be that one server is using multiple DKIM keys. So you may be getting that's one server may be receiving messages from different servers within that system, or they could be potentially using different keys in that case. So if you see, typically you shouldn't see more than two. Like Office 365 allows for 2 keys, so you may see selector 1 and selector 2 pop up. Doesn't always mean that it's a forward. It could potentially be a forward, or it could be that that message was signed twice, right? Because some people have they have Office 365, but then they send messages through an email security gateway. So they have DKIM signing on the Office 365 system, but then they also have DKIM signing on the Iron port or their Mimecast. So there's a potential aspect where you could see something like that. With sending the reports out, tax the spam filter more in a situation where you're getting large amounts of phishing all at once. Now, typically when you get the aggregate reports is within a certain time frame. So if you leave it to like the default 24 hours, so the 84,600 seconds, then reports going to have an aggregate. So it's going to tell you with for Google, it'll tell you within this 24-hour period, this is all the messages. So you're not, for aggregate reports, you're not going to get like a message per minute or anything like that, or per message. You can get one full aggregate. The forensic reports, you may get a message, you may get for each message. It shouldn't cause any issues or cause any problems. At least I have not seen any reports or any issues of problems. It just ends up being more that people get too inundated with all the reports. So if you start getting reports that show you might be getting spoofed, what do you do with that information? Really, the only thing that's telling you is if you're seeing messages that spoofed and you're at none, you really need to make your way up to a quarantine or reject, so that the way those messages are being blocked and they're being rejected or they're being quarantined. That's really what the key is in that aspect of it. You know, I mean, if you definitely, there's no way of looking and knowing what those IPs or those domains are, they're most likely being spoofed. But in most cases, depending on, again, which type of system you're using or which type of service you're using, some of them will tell you that these may be legitimate. You just need to determine whether it's actually being used or not. So if you configure DMARC wrong as in reject from the start, you could end up not receiving email from all that corporate or business. How do you prevent this? So if you set up your DMARC policy at reject from the start, which is not recommended to do, really the best thing to do is drop down to none for your policy, fix your SPF and DKIM, and then work your way back up. Review those reports and move your way back up. That's really the best thing to do, those, because we have seen cases in many reports where people have said, I mean, it was again also a large financial corporation that did that. They went straight to reject because they did everything to review. They did SPF and DKIM and DMARC last. They reviewed everything, and based on what they knew, they were able to go to DMARC reject. But then the admin assistant of the CEO called up and said that the CEO newsletter is not going to anybody. Nobody's getting it. The reason was because the IT staff was not aware that there was a third-party tool being used. So really the best thing to do is don't jump to reject, change your policy, start off at none. If you already have a policy reject, drop down to none. Make sure your RUA is set up at minimum, and if not RUF as well, but RUA, get those reports, review those reports, make sure everything is set up correctly, and then work your way back up. So some aggregate reports I get show SPF failures for the domain. The reports are showing the host name of my mail server, i.e. the fully qualified domain name rather than my domain names. So what may happen in that kind of situation is that you may have to check how those might be like relay servers. So those mail relay servers, what you have to basically do, there's a setting inside of there where you can tell it what the actual domain is and tell it not to use the name of the server, but to use the domain name. And that will actually fix those issues. If you want to send me an email, we can go into it further in terms of what type of server it is and things like that. For key rotation, do you recommend not to use the current selectors with the new keys, but publish new pair of selectors with new keys and place them into production? So it depends on the situation. If you're using a third-party provider, you have no choice but to use their selectors and use their keys, and they're typically C names, and they will hopefully do the rotation for you. If you're doing it on your own, okay, and you decide to use different selectors each time, that's fine, because some people do that. But some people use the date for the selector name, so that the way they know when the DKIM key was created. That's fine. Just make sure that the servers that's signing it knows that's the selector that's being used. That way, when it's signing it, it's inputting the right selector in the message, because otherwise you will run into issues. So that's something that you may need to take and you need to be wary of and be cautious of. So Whatever's signing it, make sure that knows it's using the right selector. When you're publishing it in DNS, make sure you use the right selector as well, and you make the change there as well. So at this point, we're 3 minutes over. We did start 2 minutes late, so technically we're 1 minute over. I do not see any questions, but again, we are here to help. We're here to provide guidance. So if you have reports and you're getting reports and you're using one of those tools that are available to you, right? If you're using one of the paid services, the customer support for those organizations are great. You know, utilize them. But we're also here to help you as well. So that way we can take a look. We can help you look at the reports. You know, if you're using some of the free sources, we can try to look at those reports and then get that information for you and help you out with it. But you need to get those reports because GCA does not provide an aggregate reporting service. We don't provide those capabilities, but we can at least help you with those, try to help you with the report reviews and help you get right in the direction and try to get you up to the reject if we can, as best as we can. So my email address is there. Remember, you can also go to the community forum. I know in the emails that you've been sending the past few, the address for the community forum has been incorrect. So it's fully global cyber, it's community.globalcyberalliance.org. The C is missing in the link in the email that we provided you. We'll get that fixed on the next one. But I mean, if you go to our DMARC website, there's links to the community forum there as well. Please post your questions there and we'll try to get your questions as quickly as it can. Or again, you're always welcome to email us directly as well. So thank you everyone for attending. Just so you know, next week is our wrap-up session. The next week, we're actually going to go into detail about some other email protocols. So we'll just do a very quick overview and reminder of the key parts of DMARC, but then we're going to talk about things like BIMI, ARC, DANE, MTSTS. We're not going to go into a deep dive into those, but at least we'll get you a few information and get you started with some of the things that are involved with each one of those. There are some other email security protocols that you need to consider using and implementing, because DMARC is not your only secure mechanism, right? That's one of a few in terms of having a good defense in depth placement when you're setting up email and securing your email services. So that's what we're going to do next week. So if you haven't registered, please register, because that is another important session. So thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next week.